Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm happy to welcome back returning guest Dr. Warren Throckmorton to the show. Thanks for dropping in.
Oh, my pleasure. Good to be with you.
Yeah, it's been great to catch up. I'm thinking about the last time we talked was last year, 2020. We had a really interesting discussion about the Christian nationalist historian, quote unquote, David Barton. Mm-hmm. And that was really interesting. Has there been any updates on the David Barton front since we talked last time?
He remains active. Although under the radar, I think he tries to maintain a low profile, but he does continue to recruit politicians and try to get Christian nationalists into office. He's backing a politician for Senate in Ohio, Josh Mandel, in the Republican primary there. And this is actually Mandel's a longtime Barton supporter. I mean, they support each other. Mm-hmm. And he, continues to, he's persistent. If anything, David Barton is persistent. I have to give him that.
He's very good. He's very active in a lot of different spheres and levels, isn't he? His name just sort of pops up. In fact, I noticed him the other day because on the 4th of July, I'm sure you saw that in the newspapers nationwide, Steve Green of Hobby Lobby took out an advert. Did you see that? It was a full-page ad. I guess he does every year. He does one. And then it said at the bottom that it was essentially he had a help from wall builders to put this advertisement together. It was all about America as a Christian nation, one nation under God. And I thought, aha, there's David Barton. He's popping up again with Hobby Lobby now.
That's right. Well, that's a long-standing relationship too.
Yes.
David has made his, he's been shrewd about it. He has recruited and sought after wealthy evangelicals, and it's been mutual. They've sought him out as well because they have common cause to advance a privileging of Christianity over other religions. They'll never admit that. They'll never say that that's what they're
their agenda
about, but because they know that sounds bad, and it is. I mean, that's not our system, but they secretly, or not so secretly, and amongst themselves, they believe that is our system, that we are a Christian nation in the United States, and that that is the way it was supposed to be, that's the way it was, and that's the way it needs to be again.
It should be again. Well, I wanted to catch up on David Barton really quick, because I know that's one of your areas of expertise, having written a book about his Jefferson lies and helping to get it pulled off the shelves and all that. But if people hadn't listened to that, they can go back and track that episode down. But I contacted you because the Mark Driscoll Mars Hill thing is kind of blowing up at the moment. Christianity Today, of course, as we know, as we're doing this recording, they've released at least 5, maybe 6 episodes. They're doing an in-depth discussion on the implosion of Mars Hill, Seattle. Have you been listening to that podcast, by the way?
I have. I would say if you are an evangelical, or you know one, or you're interested in them as a group, this is must-listen media. That series. I'm assigning it in one of my classes this fall. Yes, in the industrial organizational class, as a part of organizational psychology. I think it, particularly since I teach at a Christian college, I think it's a rare effort that evangelicals are making to really look at themselves, to look at evangelical figures who really messed up, and to do it in a critical way, to do it in a way to learn something, to try to get something out of it. And I think nothing's perfect, of course. I mean,
Sure. You can pick it apart.
We can pick it apart. I mean, anybody can do that. And there may be some legitimate things that can be said along those lines, but just the idea that a long form journalistic effort exists to, I mean, it's been 7 years.
Sure.
And so, it should have happened sooner, really, but still, that it's happening at all is
it's only a good thing.
Really a good thing to look at what happened in that movement. And can you imagine if all of these failures in evangelicalism got that kind of treatment? I mean, we'd be, as a group, evangelicals would make a lot fewer errors, it seems like. We'd be too busy analyzing them.
A little bit of accountability would be good, yeah.
Yeah,
which is obviously,
that's what I think.
one of the things that was sorely lacking at Mars Hill and whatever. I'm sure we'll get into all that. But yeah, one thing that strikes me, as you say, the Christianity Today, I've listened to the first 5 anyway. I'm sure there are more episodes coming out. But one of the things that struck me is, yes, as you say, it is coming from an evangelical point of view. So you have to keep that in mind. And the other thing that I was hoping we could get into at some point in this episode is they haven't said, at least not yet, they've not used the word cult or sort of cult psychology, cult tactics. But the more I listen to these episodes, the more I'm struck by the parallels between what happened at Mars Hill and even what's happening now at Mark Driscoll's church in Scottsdale, Arizona. There's some very classic sort of cult parallels. So I'm sure we can get into that as well. But I'm interested to find out, when did you start getting involved in the Mars Hill Seattle saga?
It was relatively late in their history. I had not heard, I'd heard the name Mark Driscoll before I started writing about it, but I'm not much of a follower of people or anything, so I didn't know much about him. I heard something about his involvement at John MacArthur's church. He at a conference that MacArthur called Strange Fire, and the only reason I heard about that was because I'd read on social media, this is now back in 2013, that MacArthur was basically saying charismatics were all, doomed, damned to hell. At least that's how it was presented in social media. And while I'm not a charismatic and am not sympathetic exactly to that perspective, I thought that was a little extreme. And I don't follow that kind of Christianity either to just condemn everybody. And so then I heard Driscoll went there and passed out his books and kind of did a little stunt, and I thought it was kind of funny in a way. And then he went on a Janet Mefford show, and to talk about his book. And Janet Mefford is very conservative, much more conservative than me on things. And I thought maybe she was wrong at first.
About his plagiarism?
About his plagiarism.
Yes.
And so I thought, well, Janet and I, we've known each other for a long time. We don't agree on much, but I thought, well, I'm going to see if she's right about this. And so I looked into it, and lo and behold, I had to admit that she probably was right. And so I wrote a piece about it, and I thought, even though we're just not on the same wavelength, I thought, well, she's getting a raw deal here. And
he really did, yeah.
He's taken advantage of the situation because she's a woman, and she's a strong woman. She really is. I mean, she's not going to back down from anybody, and she didn't back down from him. And I admire that about her. I admired that then. So I started writing about the thing, and lo and behold, I found all kinds of what I called then citation errors. I was trying not to get sued.
You were being generous, huh?
I didn't want to get sued. I wouldn't be.
You were saying straight out plagiarism.
Yeah.
So in other words, you were saying, he had quoted from different authors without giving credit for the citation.
Yeah, in my academic work, that's plagiarism. I mean,
It is
that's what we
plagiarism.
call it.
Yep.
And that's, what I think the history has now told us his publishers thought of it, because they ended up going back and correcting a lot of that stuff after I pointed it out. But I went through all his books, and it kind of became a little scavenger hunt to
Find the citation.
find
Well,
and find the place where it wasn't cited, and then find where it actually came from. And so
yeah.
I found it in several of his books and published lots of articles. And so that's how I got started. This was end of 2013, beginning of 2014. And then when I started doing that, people who used to work at Mars Hill and people who worked at Mars Hill at the time started sending me documents and anonymously telling me things about Mars Hill that were shocking. And I turned my attention to exposing those things. And it wasn't, when I say exposing those things, it wasn't Driscoll stubbed his toe and said a bad word in the cloakroom, and I said, oh, naughty Driscoll.
Yeah, finger wagging.
These are things that were going on in public that nobody would talk about because they were afraid of him. And
there was a lot of intimidation, wasn't there? A lot of basically bullying, and it created a very toxic culture, from what I understand.
Yes. For example, this is a story that, never got out because he told people not to talk about it. He was at a church, one of the church campuses of Mars Hill had a fundraising evening. It was a service, and they were trying to raise money for the campus. I don't know if it was to buy the building or renovate the building or something like that. And they didn't make their goal. Not enough money came in that night. And everybody had worked really hard, but it didn't happen, And Driscoll got up to pray, and he prayed something like, Lord, forgive us, for having such a terrible church and having no faith. And he basically just
lambasted the audience
blasted
in the guise of the prayer.
In prayer.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, all these people felt like failures, and it was, I can't even do justice to how bad it was. I don't know if he swore exactly in the prayer, but he was blasting them and telling them how bad they were. And, something like, forgive us for wasting this opportunity for ministry, or some such thing as that.
Right.
And some of these people who had given like lots of money,
quite a bit,
and they didn't have. And that's the thing.
It was a sacrificial thing, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And that always just really got to me. It kept me in this story, was how a guy who was making $500,000 to preach a time or two a week, he would stand up and blast people who were making lots less and given lots more of their income so he could make $500,000. That just really bothers me. And so
there was a lot of that. Yeah.
That kind of stuff. See, this is what I mean by like exposing. There were lots of witnesses to that, but nobody talked about it because they were ashamed of it. And they were made to feel shame if they told people. And that's when you talk about, cult and all that stuff, that's part of the mind control that people who come out of the church, they're like, wait a minute, this happened in public. Why should I feel that I can't talk about it? Of course I should be able to talk about it. But that's the kind of control that you start to give up when you enter and stay in groups like this.
Yeah, when you're that deep into the system. Well, some of the comments that Driscoll made over the years, just listening to that Christianity Today podcast, I'd never heard that quote. He was at a conference, I think, and he said something to the effect that there's a pile of bodies behind, or dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus. And by God's will, when we're done, there's going to be a mountain of dead bodies. And it was all about you either get out of the way of the bus or you get on board, or you're going to be one of the dead, dead bodies. And that was, again, shocking. And people said at the time, well, that's just Mark. I mean, that's the ruthless sort of vision for the church that we have to have. And now they're looking back in absolute shock. I mean, who talks that way as a pastor of a church? I mean, when I was a pastor, I would have I would have never stood up in front of the church and said, there's a pile of dead bodies behind this thing. You either get on
Sure.
board or get out of our way. And that's such a cutthroat attitude for a pastor to have.
Yeah, he called it blessed subtraction.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it shows how far removed he was and maybe is from the way that church life is done in Main Street. I go to a little church, I don't know, 100 people or so on a good day. We would never think of one person leaving as a good thing, because you don't have that many people to spare.
Right. A small church.
And he's like, oh, we can just throw them under the bus and it's a good thing. We don't, care about them. All we care about is getting them on our page and in our vision. And by that, he means my vision.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, if anyone disagreed with his particular vision, they were gone. As we saw many times, he would fire elders. In fact, that might have been the same meeting where he said, I've just fired 2 elders, minutes ago,
Right.
sort of thing,
Right.
before I got up here to speak, and they're out of here. They questioned my vision and they were gone. And like you said, the cult psychology of it, there's many, many stories of people who were booted out of the church unceremoniously and then shunned. The church would come after them in several ways, and people were instructed not to have anything to do with them. And of course, he's doing that now, which I'm sure we can get into at some point. But his church in Arizona is even worse, if it were possible, because he's in complete control now. He has no accountability, apparently.
Well, I was listening to the most recent episode there of Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and I was reminded of the treatment that Paul Petrie and his wife experienced after he was fired in 2007. And it just struck me again that how much like what's going on now that was. We say it's worse now, but I had to be reminded of that by listening to Paul talk about that there was no real explanation. His wife was shunned. She got no phone calls. People were instructed not to talk to her. And that kind of shunning was, here's a person who built their entire social existence around a group of people at a church. And this is indeed what evangelicals are kind of taught to do, and what, is socially acceptable to do. And then all of a sudden, one day, for really no reason, you find that nobody will talk to you. This is unconscionable, and
Shocking. Yeah.
that is what is going on. What people are reporting is going on at the Trinity Church in Scottsdale, Arizona. But it is, I'd even kind of fallen into, well, this is now worse. Well, actually, it's about what happened to the Petries.
Yeah, it's the same playbook, isn't it? That's the thing that struck me about it. I've been doing a lot of research on Driscoll because it's interesting. In my case, our paths nearly crossed on multiple occasions. We have kind of some things in common. Even though he wasn't born in Washington State, Mark Driscoll grew up not far from where I grew up in the south of Seattle area. He went to high school at a local high school that I know very well. And he went to the same exact seminary that I did down in Portland and did the exact same degree that I did at the same seminary. He did an MA in exegetical theology just a few years before I started going there. So, had I been a little bit sooner, I would have been his classmate at the seminary, and he obviously went on to found Mars Hill in Seattle, which was my hometown. We went and visited the church a couple times, and I was struck by the sort of franchise church model. That was the thing that struck me right off the bat. These satellite churches that broadcasted his sermons every Sunday. You didn't have a local preacher. You had Mark Driscoll on the big screen. And even then it struck me that this is like an empire building thing. This is a monument to his ego, surely. I mean, who does that to have all these franchise churches? It's such a strange model, isn't it?
Well, it did become about that. It became about his brand.
Yeah, he said, "I am the brand" at one point,
Right.
allegedly.
Well, yeah, that's a story I've heard from multiple people who were in a meeting. The background of that is that some of the people in the branding team, there was a kind of a communications team that wanted to make Mars Hill about some of the music that they were doing. They were really had some great bands.
Oh yeah,
The music was quite good, and they wanted to make Mars Hill known for more than just preaching in church. And Driscoll wasn't having it. And in the meeting where that conversation was taking place, he said, basically, I am the brand. I'm in the pulpit preaching. That's the brand of this church, and that's all it's ever going to be. So, and what the consequences of that was that other pastors rarely spoke. Now, in the beginning, that wasn't true. In the beginning, other people did preach, and he shared those duties, but he later wanted to preach all the sermons, didn't want anyone else to. In fact, told some of the pastors that it would be like somebody dating his wife, that he's the pastor there, he's the preaching pastor, nobody else gets to do
share
that.
the limelight, huh? We are just taking a short break in this conversation with Dr. Warren Throckmorton. When we come back, we're going to get into this issue of Mark Driscoll, cult leader personality. Does he fit the profile? And then later on in the episode, we're going to look at some of the very specific things that I think the Christianity Today podcast has so far missed. When we did this recording, there were only 5 episodes out, but now it's up to 7. I've listened to all 7 so far. And I think someone mentioned the word cult. It wasn't the host of the show. It was one of the guests who mentioned the word cult and potentially applied it to Mars Hill. So I'm going to be very interested to see if the Christianity Today podcast series does delve into that, as well as the current situation, which Dr. Throckmorton and I are going to talk about at the end of the show, what's happening currently in this Trinity Church that Mark Driscoll founded in Scottsdale, Arizona. That thing seems to resemble even more of a cult than what Mars Hill was doing. But before we get back into the chat with Dr. Throckmorton, I wanted to mention a real big thank you to the newest Patreon supporters of Mindshift Podcast. Thank you to Michael McKay, to Miles Shapiro, and Leilani Haywood, all of which are new Patreon supporters of the show. So thank you so much. One of the cool benefits you're going to get actually coming up very soon here, I've talked about this before, we are planning toward the end of the month a conversation with Frank Schaefer about his new book that's just about to drop. You can actually pre-order it on Amazon now. You can get it when it comes out. As soon as it drops, you'll have it. But we're going to have a discussion with Frank. There's about probably 6 or 8 of us so far that I've sent out advanced copies of the book that Frank sent me. And this is something that's only available to Patreon supporters of the show. There's still time to get on board if you want to be a part of this call. So that is a really cool thing coming up. Also, the next episode that's coming out here on Mindshift Podcast, I've got a conversation coming up with Ryan Stoller, who has done a lot of writing on the Homeschoolers Anonymous blog, which is now an archived blog. He's got his own blog. He's been speaking out for years about the abuses within the Christian homeschooling environment, which is where he comes from himself. We had a fantastic discussion, so that's actually going to be the next actual episode that comes out after this one with Warren Throckmorton. And I think going back on this, I've been doing a lot of research on the Mark Driscoll Christianity Today podcast series, the Mars Hill saga. I think I might do a complete standalone episode on this, just kind of talking about my perspectives, what I think the Christianity Today podcast is missing and what they're doing right. I'm not going to say it's all wrong. It's certainly, as I mentioned before, it is coming from an evangelical perspective. And I think they're missing out on the cult psychology aspect of it as well. And in fact, one of the things that I wish we'd have gotten into in this discussion with Dr. Throckmorton is something that Kristen Kobes-Dumay talks about in her book, Jesus and John Wayne. And she mentions Driscoll specifically as a sort of a case study of how this toxic, masculine, evangelical, biblical patriarchy model, this muscular Christianity, and the abusive leadership style that conditions so many evangelicals. I mean, Driscoll's not the only one. There's a direct through line between what Mark Driscoll was doing at Mars Hill and many other celebrity-type pastors and Donald Trump, the evangelical support for Donald Trump. So that's something I'm going to look into in my episode that I'm working on putting together right now, the standalone episode on Mars Hill. So look for that coming out maybe within the next month or so. But in the meantime, I'm going to continue listening to that Christianity Today podcast. I am very interested to see where they're going to take it. And so we'll see where this thing goes with CT. But as Warren says, it's a good thing in a sense that an evangelical organization is doing an investigation. That can only be a good thing, because if nothing else, maybe some of the evangelical audiences will listen to it, and that can only be a good thing. And I guess it's doing quite well. Someone said to me on Twitter the other day that it's reached like number 3 in the rankings, so it's blown up. So that means there's a big audience listening to this stuff. So that's a good thing. It's a step in the right direction, if nothing else. Anyway, let's get back on into the chat with Dr. Warren Throckmorton as we look into the cult psychology of Mark Driscoll as a cult leader. Does he fit that profile? And then we're also going to analyze Mars Hill and, as I said before, his current church in Scottsdale, Arizona. What's happening there? Some very disturbing reports are coming out. So let's get on back into this conversation about the legacy of the Mars Hill, Seattle, Mark Driscoll's toxic cult of personality. I was reading an article by Rachel Bernstein of the Indoctrination podcast, and she's also a therapist. She deals with a lot of religious trauma syndrome, and she wrote this article about a cult leader profile. And what she said was that, I mean, obviously there's different cult leader profiles. One thing they all share in common, of course, is that most cult leaders are narcissists of some degree, and they have a massive ego. But she said one cult leader is the kind of person, they don't necessarily start out envisioning, I want to have a cult here, or a giant cult of personality. But as they grow and get more strokes and their ego builds, they become more and more about them being in the limelight, whatever that might be. That seems to fit the kind of trajectory of Mars Hill, I think, wasn't it? Where, like you just described, Mark didn't start out to be the only guy preaching, but as time went on, it was like, no, it's all about me. I think he said at some point, yeah, this is Mars Hill. This is me up on stage with a Bible. That's what it's going to be. And that's how it has to be. It was like a monument to his ego, it seems like.
Well, that's what the Christianity Today podcast is really developing, is this idea that he didn't start out with a plan. And that's very consistent with what I found in 2014 when I interviewed hundreds of former members and attenders, people who were close to the beginning of the church. I interviewed Leif Moy, who was one of the co-founders. Some of the other people were there. Ron Wheeler, one of Driscoll's early colleagues. And it's all consistent that at the beginning, it was, let's just get something going. Let's get something
Just do a Bible
different.
study, wasn't it? In his house, I think.
It was, but even more than that, it was, yes, a Bible study, but if getting something going in Seattle where we can start a church of some kind required something else besides a Bible study, we would do that. And they, did the concert venue. I heard a lot about that in my interviewing, that, they had bands in that had nothing to do with religion, and it was just to attract a crowd. They wanted to attract people in. And so some of the early, quote, evangelism was just getting kids around and getting people around attracted to the music. They didn't like the music necessarily, didn't care about the music, but it was a way to reach some people in Seattle. In the typical evangelical mindset, you're trying to spread the gospel. You're trying to get the message out. You're trying to get people to accept Jesus as Savior. And that's what they were trying to do. As time went on and there was success in what they were doing, people wanted to know, how are you doing that? How's that working? Seattle's a tough place.
Yes, it is. I grew up there.
what's the method, And that's where I think, it started to become, hey, we're doing something that could maybe be marketed or could be transferred, and maybe we're part of why this is working. And I think that over time, it became maybe more about the messenger and the method than about the message and, just the result. Now, they always used the result as an excuse for whatever it was that they did. If it was questionable or ethically bad, or if people
dubious.
got hurt, well, hey, look, we're baptizing people. But
look at the numbers. Yeah.
And that's as old as revival meetings. I mean, that's, that goes back to numbers, nickels, and noise in the, among the Southern preachers, Southern evangelists. But he used the same justification for whatever it was he either wanted to do or did wrong.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on the music scene too, because I've read about it was like an all ages concert venue that somehow they were able to get the lease for it because they were a nonprofit organization, whereas if a private company had come in, it would have been too expensive. So they were able to kind of sneak in the back door. And there's an interesting side note to this too. There's a backstory, because I went to church when I was back in the evangelical days at Calvary Fellowship in Seattle. Now, that church comes up in the Mars Hill story because it was in the exact same neighborhood that Mars Hill was started in, which is a neighborhood called Wallingford, which is up near the University of Washington. That's where Calvary Fellowship was located. One thing about Calvary is that we had a lot of musicians at that church. I mean, I was in a Christian metal band for years. There were loads of like grunge bands, alternative bands, all sorts of things. That church moved out in, I think, 1997. The city closed down because we used to meet in a high school, and the city wanted this property back, so the church had to move. That was right around the time that Mars Hill was starting up, and they were able to attract, I think, a lot of the musicians from Calvary, and they went on to form, bands that were part of that Tooth and Nail Records label, as well as part of the worship teams that played at Mars Hill, so a lot of that scene, I mean, that was right in that sort of university district area, real liberal area, real eclectic area, a lot of musicians, artists, free thinkers, that sort of thing. So he was looking for that demographic, but I'm not sure, as you say, that he really was into it himself, because he was a model of like, oh, well, this guy's emerging church, but his theology was straight kind of fundamentalist reformed, wasn't it? Very down the line.
I don't know when that shifted or if it did. I know he eventually became part of what has been called Young, Restless, and Reformed, with the emphasis on Reformed.
Yeah.
So the emerging part, to whatever degree that was theological, didn't last long.
If it ever was part of it, which I don't think it was, because a friend of mine that I went to seminary with, I'd never heard of Mars Hill back in 97, 98, 99. And he said, you got to go up there and check this church out. This is really wild. It's an emerging church. So we did. We took a weekend. We went up to Seattle. I was down in Portland actually going to that same seminary that Mark Driscoll went to. And so we visited the church, and I was all ready for some wild way out, theology. But it wasn't, because I looked at their website when I got back, and I thought, this is just straight boilerplate, conservative, evangelical, sort of Calvinist theology. I didn't see anything that was like, in the Brian McLaren or any of that sort of camp at all back in those days.
Yeah. Okay.
Which I thought was really interesting, because what I thought was, when I visited Mars Hill, that was about probably 2000 or 1999. They had moved into the big main building down in the Ballard area. And what struck me was, I thought, man, this is just Calvary Fellowship 2.0. This is everything that we used to do right up the street, probably 5 minutes from where our church used to meet. It's just they're a bit cooler and hipper, but it's the same exact model of church growth that we employed. And Calvary was a big church. It had probably 8,000 people. So it was not a small church. It was a big church, So I thought they'd just kind of taken probably a lot of the people that used to go to Calvary and lived in that neighborhood and just didn't want to move to the new location and just jumped over to Mars Hill.
That's a good point.
Yeah, same demographics. But it seems like you said, it all starts to unravel for Driscoll with that Janet Mefford interview, wasn't it? But then the William Wallace stuff started coming out. How much did you get into that? Because that was a whole nother bizarre piece that came out of this story.
Well, the unraveling was of course, a slow unravel after 2007, through 2014. But I published the comments. Somebody had sent them to me, where he said, as William Wallace, we are a pussified nation. and
among other things. Yeah.
oh yeah, so many other
A lot of
crude things.
rants.
That's all on the on my blog.
Sure.
If anybody wants to look that up, but he just faked this identity
Yeah.
and got on the church's chat room and chat board and just went nuts,
It really did.
uh,
Just
complaining about
rancid.
gays, complaining about feminine men, complaining about women who wanted to be equal, complaining
Yeah.
about anything. He sounded like Archie Bunker,
Yeah.
and then but he didn't want to take responsibility for it, so he made up this name William Wallace,
Hmm.
the third, I think, or so, I don't know if it was second or third, but eventually was outed or
Well, he outed
I think
himself, didn't he? Because it was in
outed
his book.
himself in his
He
book.
admitted
Yeah,
it in his Reformation Rev book, which came out in 2006 or seven. I don't remember. But the blog or the forum posts were like around about the year 2000, I think. So it was several years later that he finally outed himself as William Wallace the second or third, whichever it was.
and but those were taken down, and all that had been taken down. I think it was just when they were republished, it was like, oh wow,
Whoa,
really?
this is crazy.
Did you really say that stuff?
He said it. He
And
said the quiet part out loud, I
he
guess.
did, and so that raised it all again, and brought the whole thing again, and really raised the issues that were taken up by Mike Hosper in the podcast
Hmm.
about Mars Hill and the way that women were regarded in that ministry, in that church, and how that women were to be subservient. And even though he may have apologized for the words that he used and so forth, nothing really changed as far as the way women were regarded and the
Hmm.
roles that they were expected to have. They were all supposed to, be married and have lots of kids and
Yeah, submit to their husbands and all that.
to
Yeah.
their husband, and even, well, just the whole thing was that there are these very rigid roles that the men play and women play. And
Hmm.
of course, we could really have a whole podcast episode on this, but
Oh yeah.
men are also bound by these things because it's like men can't be soft or cry, or men are bound by these roles too. It's just that the advantage that men have is that they get to be the boss of everything, and
Mm.
that's the role they have. And women, they're constricted too. They can only do so many things, but they don't ever get to be the boss of anything except maybe the kids.
Right.
And so that's the Mars Hill legacy, if you will, or one of the legacies of Mars Hill that the Christianity Today podcast goes over. And so even though he can apologize and did in 2014 for the actual words he used, it really didn't change the way that women felt that their role was continued to be through right to the end
Hmm.
of the church. And
Absolutely.
that's one of the I know a lot of the elders who have come away from Mars Hill and who feel really damaged and that they did damage at Mars Hill. That's one of the things that they talk to me a lot about, is that they feel really bad about maintaining
Hmm.
those
Helping to
promote those roles. Yeah.
Well, and even I remember one of the elders, I can't remember whose name it was, but he was saying on the Christianity Today podcast at the time when the William Wallace stuff was being written, around about 2000, and then when they found out it was Driscoll who was writing it, they were like, "Oh, well, just kind of shrugged their shoulders." And wow, now they're looking back on it and saying, "What in the world?" Like you were talking about the conditioning that I mean, you read it now. I was reading on Rachel Held Evans' blog. There's some archived stuff on there, and she has a couple of posts about where she cites some of the rants that Driscoll said. And like you said, there's an equal side to it. The toxic masculinity, the
Mm-hmm.
sort of macho Christianity, the tough guy. But yet I remember one of his quotes. He said, talking to men, he said, "You want to be a rebel in our society? Get a job, mow your lawn, and take care of your family, and shut up." So even with the men, I mean, it's just a crazy statement, isn't it? get a job, mow your lawn, and shut up. I mean, that's what a man's supposed to do, apparently. Do your family thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all very simple, right? I mean,
I
that's
guess so.
that's the world according to Mars Hill is, you do your thing, and everything's great. And when life, of course, isn't that way and isn't that simple, then you just pretend that it is and
I guess
don't
so.
talk about it when it's not.
Shovel it under the carpet. So this is the interesting part. Okay, so Mark Driscoll was supposed to be restored. When the big thing that finally, I guess, broke it wide open, there was the plagiarism interview with Janet Mefford. Then all this stuff's coming out. Then the New York Times bestseller list. That was another big kind of scandal, wasn't it? Where it was
Yes.
discovered that they had used a huge amount of money to get his book on marriage to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, wasn't it?
That's right. Yes, it was a deception, of course, because it was never disclosed to anybody that that book was on the bestseller list because this group called Result Source, they were a consulting group, and they had agreed with the church. They were paid by the church to purchase 11,000 copies of the book, as if individuals had bought it at retail.
To drive up the rankings and everything. Yeah.
The church was entitled to purchase that many copies at a discount and then just, give them away or sell them at a discount. But that wouldn't have helped the bestseller list. They had to buy them at retail.
Right. Posing as individual buyers.
Right. They had like 1,000 different accounts. Result Source did.
Amazing.
With fake credit cards, fake gift cards, and so forth. Make it look like it was, everybody wanted the book. And they do that for other people. Driscoll's not alone in that. But they use church money to do it. And Driscoll acts surprised when he got on, he tweeted out some surprise tweet.
I'm
like,
shocked.
Look, we're on the list.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. We made the bestseller list. Wow. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, how'd that happen? So, when it came out and I published the contract that the church signed with Result Source, it showed just how kind of gross all that was and unseemly it was. And he said, I'm sorry, and I'll take the best-selling author off all my books, and tried to make a pretense of trying to correct it. But that really did change things in the minds of people. People stopped going to church, and then they ran into financial trouble because the giving went way down. And as that happened, they were pretty highly leveraged. They had a lot of properties, they owed money on them, and it just became unsustainable as time went on. They had to lay off staff. More revelations came out toward the end. We're actually in the month of August, and 7 years ago, the month of August was horrendous for Mars Hill. Acts 29 Church Planting Network kicked Driscoll out of the network that he co-founded. They kicked the church out of the Acts 29 network. It was very public. I published that. There were a number of other things that the elders did. They came forward with charges against Driscoll that needed to be investigated. That was former elders. Then existing elders also suggested that Driscoll take some time off. So the month of August was really the turning point when all of what had been brewing under the surface just came to the surface, and then it
bubbled up. All the chickens came home to roost in August then.
That's right. And then September, October, November, he took time off. The investigation took forward, and then eventually the elders who investigated the charges against him came back and said, you're disqualified from ministry. We'd like you to go through a restoration process and be requalified. He said, basically, no, I quit.
Yeah,
and that's where it ended. He resigned.
Yeah, so he, as far as I could tell, the story was rather than go through a process of accountability and maybe get some therapy, counseling, because one of the things we didn't talk about was, as you kind of alluded to, there was a long history of him being a very abusive, bullying type of personality. I guess he would shout at people in staff meetings, and of course he would fire people, and really was intimidating, and quite a sort of a bullying, threatening figure. So that was another one. It must have been one of the things they were investigating, surely, wasn't it?
It was. One illustration I can give, and I could give. I mean, there were pages and
Yeah,
pages
dozens.
of these illustrations. But in one meeting, again, let me highlight something here. This is not Mark Driscoll in his closet, hammering a nail and hits his thumb, and he says,
Yeah,
the S word. That's not what this is. This is in public meetings and staff meetings where there are, 10, 15, 20 people. And, this is like at your job.
yeah. People
And
worked at the church.
so he's leading a meeting. All right. So in one of these meetings, there's a pastor who doesn't swear. He just believes it's wrong to swear.
Hmm.
And so Driscoll thinks that's funny. And so he says, I want you to say, I think it was the F word. Yeah, I need you to swear in this meeting.
Right. He's baiting this guy.
Baiting this guy to do something he thinks is sinful. And
Wow.
so finally they get him to do it. And everybody laughs and care. And this guy he's
Yeah,
mortified.
mortified.
And so this is harassment. I mean, this is just,
Yeah,
if
that's straight
that's why
abusive. Yeah.
I want to do this in my industrial organizational class,
Mm,
because I want people and my students to understand that harassment and on the job bullying takes place in churches,
sure.
not just in industry.
Yeah,
And this is
absolutely.
a good example of it. And so there's just page after page of this stuff that the elders investigated and found that there's good reason to believe he did it.
But yeah, you got to think, as you said before, what do you mean investigated? Because these people surely were in meetings for years and they saw the real Driscoll,
That's right.
so what do you mean investigate? All you got to do is think back to however many years of meetings where you were berated and belittled and bullied by Driscoll to
Yep.
think this is a head pastor of a very, very large church. Surely this guy is not qualified to be in leadership of a church for sure.
Well, that's right. And some of them, not all of them, were in every meeting, and so there was a need to
Sure, yeah. Get your stories
confirm,
straight. Yeah.
various stories and so forth. But you're right. They were very believable stories because many of them had experienced similar things.
So this is the real concern, is that I guess it's about 2 years later, he starts this church in Scottsdale, Arizona, Trinity Church, as you mentioned before. And there's this huge list of senior pastors and Christian evangelical leaders that are backing him. And now he's got this thing. I don't know how big it is. There seems to be conflicting stories. When it first started out, it wasn't very big. I heard that it's around 2,000 people, but he's got an iron grip over this Trinity Church, because the story that you reported on was one that Julie Roy's talked about, where it was like a family that came to the church and were involved in music ministry. And then I guess the guy's son was dating Driscoll's daughter and let it slip that they'd kissed at one point, and that just caused a firestorm. They got booted out of the church. They got shunned. They were investigated by the police. I mean, it was just this huge over-the-top reaction to just a teenage romance, I guess, is what it sounded like.
Right. Yeah. The family was surveilled by
Yeah, it's insane.
private investigators and various security details of the church, and
Yeah, it
it's
sounds like Scientology's fair gaming type stuff, doesn't it?
it does.
That's what they do.
There are a number of parallels to stories that people who've been in Scientology tell, and I mean, so again, you think, well, this is worse. Well, things like that happened at Mars Hill too. They just all those stories. There's still stories that haven't come out about Mars Hill, but it's a similar kind of dynamic. If you cross the leaders there, cross the Driscoll family, then you're definitely on the outs.
Yeah, you're persona non grata. And as they say, that you may leave the church, but the church doesn't leave you. you could be harassed and followed and investigated and even have the local police come out, so it's a crazy, but that's the thing is, okay, looking at it now sort of objectively, what type of cultic parallels would we draw? We said there's the shunning piece, the sort of egomaniac, the narcissistic cult leader. What other cult parallels could you think of that maybe where it does resemble sort of this cult psychology?
I think it's, without getting too stuck on the term cult, I think I would probably focus on control and the idea of control of one's thoughts, control of one's information, control of behavior.
Right. So the bite model.
The bite model I think is a really good one. That's how I try to analyze this sort of thing. And I look at what's going on there, and I see a lot of efforts to control who people are friends with. That's really what stood out to me. And the thing that I think is the most heartbreaking is the family manipulations, controlling who can, if you can see grandchildren or not, based upon whether you favor the Driscolls. And so they have a couple of families that have married into the Driscoll family, a couple kids married Driscoll kids, and those in-laws have been estranged from their kids. They can't see their kids, or they don't have kids yet. They don't have grandchildren yet, but if they did, they would be isolated from them. And then there's a staff member who has been instructed not to allow the grandchildren to see their grandparents. And these kinds of efforts to control, that's what I focus more on. And so you can't really say, well, it's this kind of cult or that kind of cult, but what you can do is take a look at who is making the decisions for individuals. And if you make, quote, the wrong decision or go against the leadership, what consequences are there? And if there are consequences for making a free choice, then you really have to look at whether or not you should be in that group.
Right. Do I want to be a part of this thing? This might not be a good idea. Well, I know you have to go. We've been talking for nearly an hour. I was just thinking, too, that you've got a lot of information on your blog. As you've alluded to, you've written, I don't know, hundreds, I don't know how many, maybe thousands of articles over the years. Where can people find your blog if they wanted to research more information on Mark Driscoll and the Mars Hill saga?
The address is wthrockmorton.com. And I'm also on Twitter, pretty active on Twitter. Throckmorton is my handle there. So Throckmorton, THROCKMORTON.com, and on the web.
It's a very good resource. I know I've used it many, many times, just researching obviously the David Barton stuff and now the Mars Hill Mark Driscoll saga. I may do a standalone episode because I've got a backstory, kind of some of the things I alluded to going to Calvary Fellowship, and Mark Driscoll's paths and I nearly crossed several times. And, there's some interesting parallels there. I mean, I don't pastor a megachurch at all, for sure. I never did. But yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on. But listen, Dr. Warren Throckmorton, thank you so much for your work, your investigative journalism, helping to shine a light on people like Mark Driscoll, David Barton, and so many others.
Thank you. Appreciate you saying that.